So you can access those. And for questions for today's presentation, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And let me get on with the introductions here. First of all, Christy Cleaver has been in Idaho since 2015 as a plant pathologist with the USDA Forest Service in the Forest Health Protection area in Coeur d'Alene. Now, Forest Health Protection detects, identifies, and monitors forest diseases and insects, conducts forest health evaluations and surveys, provides maintenance, management guidance, and trainings and conservation education. Christy received her Bachelor of Science degree in forest biology and natural resource management and her master's degree in ecology with a forest pathology emphasis from Colorado State University. And she has worked in forest pathology for 11 years in Colorado, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho, all over the West, with emphasis on white pine blister rust and high elevation white pines, dwarf mistletoes, root diseases, and hazard trees. So with that introduction, I will turn the time over to Christy. Welcome.
Thanks, Preston. Let me get my presentation going here. Are you able to see my screen?
I can see it. Fine.
Okay, great. Excellent. So I have dual monitors here. So if you are looking at my video, I'm probably not going to be looking straight at the camera. I don't want to mess with trying to move them around. So I'll be looking here at my presentation as I give this presentation. So as Preston said, I'm Christy Cleaver. Good morning, everyone. I'm a plant pathologist with Forest Health Protection in Coeur d'Alene. And before I get into talking about the subject at hand, which is whitebark pine, I just wanted to touch a little bit more on what we do. And for some reason, my slide is not advancing. Okay, here we go. Forest Health Protection is under a division of the U.S. Forest Service called State and Private Forestry. And we are regions 1 and 4 of the U.S. Forest Service. We have field offices in Coeur d'Alene, Missoula, Boise, and Ogden. And within our field offices, we have entomologists, plant pathologists, support specialists, and also technicians. And Preston mentioned a little bit about what we do. We provide both technical and financial assistance in forest insect and disease issues. We give trainings. Our big training that we give every year is our insect and disease identification and management training, and also hazard tree trainings, among others. We conduct surveys, namely our aerial surveys, where we assess forest insects and diseases from the air, and we're often involved in special projects. And some of us specialize in certain areas with certain insects or diseases. I'm currently the Forest Health Protection whitebark and limber pine representative for Region 1. And I'm also the administrator of the National Forest Health Protection Whitebark Pine Restoration Program. So whitebark pine is in a special group of 5-needled pines. And all of these pines have needles that occur in bunches or fascicles of 5 needles. They're stress tolerant, and they grow and thrive in areas where most other tree species cannot grow and thrive. And these are ridge tops, mountain tops, areas that receive a lot of wind. And these pines are generally long-lived species as well. And there are several that occur in North America. Whitebark pine, of course, occurs in 7 states, also in Canada, in British Columbia, and Alberta, and it occurs at higher elevations. Limber pine has a wider distribution than whitebark pine, occurs in 13 states in Canada, and also has a wider elevation range, so it will occur at lower elevations than whitebark pine. There's Rocky Mountain bristlecone pine, It occurs in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. Great Basin bristlecone pine occurs in California, Utah, and Nevada. And then foxtail pine occurs just in California. So whitebark pine is Pinus albicollis. It's a 5-needled stone pine. It is the only stone pine that occurs in North America. And it's named stone pine for its seeds, which are stone-like. They're large and dense. And these seeds lack wings, so they're not wind distributed. And also the cones don't open at maturity. So they actually require a dispersal agent, and these are typically birds or squirrels. And the primary dispersal agent of whitebark pine is Clark's nutcracker. This is a co-evolved mutualism. So the bird, the primary food source of the bird are whitebark pine seeds, and the primary seed disperser of whitebark pine is the bird. And some say, or I've heard this called as their evolutionary soulmates. So the bird will obtain the seeds in the cones by penetrating the cones with its beak. It will pull the seeds out, and it will store the seeds in a special pouch that is in its throat. And it can store up to 100 seeds or more in this special pouch. Then it will cache seeds in locations that occur up to a few miles from the source, or sometimes up to about 20 miles. And these caches are buried about an inch or so underground and usually contain about 1 to 15 seeds, but 3 to 5 is average. Throughout the course of a year, the nutcracker may store greater than 35,000 seeds, and sometimes up to 100,000 seeds during good cone years. The nutcracker has this fantastic spatial memory and can actually remember where it has stored all of these seeds. And it's also good, it will cache more seeds than it actually needs. So it will go retrieve what it needs, and then what isn't retrieved, those seeds may be allowed to germinate, and then there'll be whitebark pine regeneration. And I want to point out that a lot of this research has been done by Diana Tombach. She's a great whitebark pine champion and works with the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. She's a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. So she and her lab have conducted a fair amount of this Clark's nutcracker research. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can look into her work. So some additional characteristics about whitebark pine are that it's a long-lived species, typically will live between 500 and 1,000 years, sometimes even more. The trees are generally between 16 and 66 feet tall, but sometimes maybe upwards of 100 feet. It has an irregular growth form. The crown may actually be rounded or irregular appearing, and there may be multiple stems, particularly on open exposed sites. And these multiple stems occur due to these seed caches that contain multiple seeds. The growth form may be stunted or shrub-like, and this is called krummholz, and it occurs at tree line and in these areas that are highly windswept. And also the tree species is slow growing. So whitebark pine occurs broadly over 80 million acres in the United States and Canada. It occurs along the coastal mountain range and also the Rocky Mountain range. And in Canada, occurs both in British Columbia and Alberta. And over 70% of the whitebark pine is in the United States and occurs in 7 states. And these states are Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and Nevada. And I want to ask you a poll question here. So I will bring it up. What percent of whitebark pine in the United States do you think occurs on federal land? Is it 50%, 75%, 88%, or 99%? Looks like just about everyone has voted here, and really good. The most votes received are for 88%, and that is correct. And 99% is not far off. So very good. Here, share results here. There we go. So you can see most of you voted for 88%. That is correct. And let's see. Okay. Yep, 88% on federal land here. And of that, 74% actually is a Forest Service, about 10% is National Park Service, and 4% is Bureau of Land Management land. Whitebark occurs at an elevation range of about 3,000 to 12,000 feet across its distribution. So whitebark pine is considered both a keystone species and a foundation species in high elevation ecosystems. And what this means is that as a keystone species, it promotes biodiversity by providing both a wildlife food source and wildlife habitat. And as a foundation species, it promotes critical ecosystem functions. And I'll discuss that a little bit more in a couple of slides. As a wildlife food source, those nutritious seeds feed many species of birds and mammals, including bears and squirrels. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a sample of animals that feed on the seeds of the whitebark pine. So Clark's nutcracker, Steller's jay, there's squirrels, chipmunks, deer mice, and also bears eat the seeds of whitebark pine, both grizzly and black bears. They do not steal the cones, but they instead raid squirrel middens for those seeds. Wildlife, the whitebark pine is also wildlife habitat for several birds of prey, ungulates, and other mammals as well. So whitebark pine contributes to these ecosystem functions. It's a very stress-tolerant tree, again, that grows in these areas where a lot of other trees can't grow, and it's often the first to establish after a disturbance. It facilitates the survival of other trees and plants. It helps to reduce soil erosion. It stabilizes snowpack, and also the trees help to slow snow melt in these high elevation ecosystems, which helps to reduce flooding at lower elevations. Whitebark also has other significance and value, including historical significance, spiritual and cultural value. There are some Native American and First Nations tribes that consume the seeds. And also it's a symbol of the upper subalpine experience for recreationalists. So these are the areas that we like to go to, these mountaintops and ridge tops, and we love to see these whitebark pine trees in these areas. So threats and stressors. What do you think are the 4 main threats to whitebark pine in the United States? This is another poll question. I'm not sure here. Let's see, how do I get, oh, here we go to the next one. Here's the poll. So what do you think here are the 4 main threats to whitebark pine in the United States? This is multiple choice, so choose 4.
Christy, while folks are voting on this, there was a question about, do we know where the oldest living whitebark pine resides?
I don't actually. Somebody does, I think, but I don't know that they disclose that location. And if somebody's on that does know or has an idea, feel free to chime in the chat. I will say I have seen some pretty large whitebark pines in the Wind River Range in Wyoming. So those are some of probably the oldest whitebark pines that I've seen, or at least believe I've seen. All right, so pretty much everyone has voted. I'll end the polling and share the results here. So 100% of you said climate change. Yep, that's one for sure. Altered fire regimes is one. White pine blister rust and mountain pine beetle. Those are the four main threats. There are others, of course. And I say in the United States, most whitebark pine is on public land in the US, and these are the four main threats in the US. In Canada, however, a lot of whitebark pine actually occurs on private land, so they have other issues going on and threats there, particularly like oil and gas drilling that they're contending with. So here we go. Okay, so white pine blister rust is the first threat. It's caused by Crenartium rubicola, and this is an introduced fungus. Mountain pine beetle, the second threat. It's a bark beetle, Dendroctonus ponderosae. Altered fire regimes is the third threat, and this is essentially fire exclusion, which has occurred throughout the last century and has led to a successional replacement of whitebark pine by other species, namely spruce and fir. And the fourth threat is climate change. And when we think about climate change threatening whitebark, we're thinking about increasing temperatures that are projected and also increasing frequency of drought, both which lead to direct effects on the pine and indirect effects through the insect diseases and fire, and then also the interacting effects of all of these. So first we'll talk about white pine blister rust. White pine blister rust is a non-native disease, and all 5-needled pines are hosts. So all those that I mentioned early on in the presentation are susceptible to the rust. It's caused by a fungus, and it's named a rust fungus because of the orange rusty colored spores that are produced by the fungus. And there are lots of native rust fungi in North America. White pine blister rust is actually the only non-native rust in North America. And the fungus causes these stem and branch girdling cankers, and that's what can kill the tree and cause the tree to decline in health. It can kill trees of all ages. Young trees may die very quickly, oftentimes within 3 years, and older trees can live for several years with blister rust, but will eventually die. White pine blister rust Eurasia, and it was actually introduced to North America from nursery stock that was imported from Europe in the early 1900s. And there were introductions into North America, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. And on the West Coast, it was introduced around the Vancouver area early on in the 1900s. And that's what you see on the map as the red line there. And it has since expanded outward throughout the range of 5-needled pines, throughout most of the range of susceptible 5-needled pines in North America. And that's what you're looking at on the map. That's not just where blister rust is in whitebark. It includes all of the pine hosts. And so mean incidence has ranges on whitebark pine in these areas. There are some areas that don't have blister rust, all the way up to greater than 70%. And I would say the highest impact from blister rust currently is around the area of northern Idaho and western Montana, so right where we are, and on up into Canada. And mean incidences of blister rust have been recorded of upwards of 70%. Otherwise, most areas, blister rust is about 20 to 40% mean incidence. I am a pathologist, so I want to throw up the slide of the blister rust life cycle and talk about it a little bit more in depth than maybe we would in other settings. But this is the life cycle of the fungus that causes the disease, white pine blister rust. And the fungus is an obligate parasite, meaning it requires a living host for survival. And the life cycle of Cronartium rubicula is complex. It actually requires two hosts, a pine host and an alternate host. And that alternate host is generally a species, a ribes species, but it could also be a species in Pedicularis or Castanea. And the life cycle goes through 5 different spore stages, which increases the complexity of it. The asiospores are produced on the pine host, and those are the orange rusty colored spores that are windblown to the alternate host late spring, early summer. And then throughout the summer, there's a spore stage called a uridinea spore that will continue to cycle on that alternate host. And eventually, late in the summer, it will give rise to teliospores, which are column-like sets of spores that are produced on the alternate host, and those give rise to basidiospores. And that's the spore stage that is windblown from the alternate host back to the pine host. And that spore will infect the pine host through the needle and will grow through the needle into the branch or main stem and cause those stem girdling cankers. And the spores from either host can travel a fair amount. Asiospores tend to be more durable, so they may travel longer, or they may travel farther. And basidiospores are more prone to desiccation, so they may not travel quite as far. So the consequences of blister rust is that it will reduce cone production by killing those cone-producing branches, and also causes mortality, trees of all ages, by either girdling the bole and killing the tree or causing excessive branch loss. Our second threat is mountain pine beetle, and this is a native bark beetle that occurs naturally in the environment. It is not introduced. And all pines are hosts of the mountain pine beetle. The photo on the right is not to scale. It's actually very tiny. It's about the size of a grain of rice. And the beetle bores into the bark of the tree, or underneath the bark of the tree, and it will create these galleries where it lays its eggs to reproduce. And it's a combination of the galleries that girdle the tree and also a fungus that it carries with it that enters the tree, blue stain fungus. The combination of those end up killing the tree. They prefer larger diameter trees to reproduce, so they don't kill young trees like blister rust would. At natural levels, mountain pine beetle kills small areas of trees, but there are periodic outbreaks, and these occur about every 30 years during favorable conditions. And we are actually still currently in an outbreak that has been occurring since 1999. And throughout this more recent outbreak, greater than 1.2 million acres of high elevation white pines, mortality has occurred in 8 Western states. It's winding down in our area in the Rocky Mountains, but it is still going pretty strong in some of the coastal populations of whitebark pine. So whitebark pine was not always a preferred species of mountain pine beetle. Because of climate change, because of warmer winters and more droughts, drier summers, this has caused pines to be more drought stress and lowers the defenses of the pine, which can allow more attack by mountain pine beetle. And also, warmer winters have created more favorable conditions in high elevation forests. So areas where typically were not as hospitable to mountain pine beetle are now becoming favorable areas for the beetle. Also, in general, the life cycle of mountain pine beetle has taken only about 1 year in most areas, and at high elevation forests, it used to take 2 years for the mountain pine beetle to complete its cycle, but that is now changing to 1 year up in these high elevation forests. And we have seen high levels of mountain pine beetle cause mortality through this most recent mountain pine beetle outbreak. The third major threat is altered fire regimes. And so historically, fires were used to historically fires reduced and removed competing vegetation and created regeneration opportunities for whitebark pine. However, over 100 years ago or so, we implemented fire suppression and exclusion, which has resulted in succession to shade-tolerant conifers, primarily spruce and fir. And fire suppression has also led to increased stand density in many areas. And increased stand density leads to a susceptibility to more catastrophic fires because of the increased fuel loading, and also to more insect and disease issues. Increased stand density is also amenable to mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle likes dense stands. The trees are competing against each other, and their defenses may be lowered a little bit, and so those stands are more desirable to mountain pine beetle. The fourth major threat is climate change, and again, we're thinking about higher temperatures, increased drought conditions. Climate change has an impact on productivity of whitebark pine. It decreases productivity, increases tree mortality, and can also exacerbate insect and disease issues like mountain pine beetle, and also causes increased fire frequency and intensity and lengthens fire season. So here is a bioclimatic model that looked at climate change, the impact of climate change on whitebark pine habitat over about a 100-year period. And this is just showing that with climate change, it's not giving them enough time for whitebark pine to respond to what's happening with climate change. And you can see from the present there's quite a bit of change moving to 2030. I think that's about a 70% reduction in a suitable habitat for whitebark pine. And then by 2090, what's predicted to occur is about 3% or less of suitable habitat compared with the present amount. So all of these threats have led to the decline of whitebark pine, and this has been documented through several surveys and monitoring and studies throughout the years. This probably goes back even prior to 1977, and this is just a sampling of some of the studies that have found whitebark pine to be in decline throughout the years. So 1977, whitebark pine is a rapidly declining keystone species in subalpine forests of the northern Rocky Mountains. 1981, in jeopardy in many areas from introduced disease and fire suppression. 1989, being depleted by succession and insects and disease epidemics. 1993, declining through much of its range and has disappeared from isolated locations. In 2006, disappeared from up to 98% of parts of its historic range. And then the latest assessment in 2018 is that 51% of standing whitebark pine is dead as of 2016. So that brings us to the current federal status, and I'll go through a little bit about how we got to the proposed listing, the recent proposed listing. So the first time that federal protections were requested was 1991. So this has been going on for a long time. In 2008, the Natural Resources Defense Council petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In 2011, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that whitebark pine warrants protection under the Endangered Species Act, but it was precluded by other listings with higher priority. So it was added to this list of candidate species that was reviewed annually. Meanwhile, in Canada, in 2012, whitebark pine was listed as endangered under their Species at Risk Act. And then finally, in 2018, the U.S. Forest Service produced a whitebark pine species status assessment. This had lots of input from research and other researchers from contributing their research, and it was reviewed widely. And this special species status assessment is available online for viewing with the proposed listing. And finally, in this December of 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed to list whitebark pine as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And now we are currently in the 60-day comment period, and these comments are due by February 1st, so just here in a few days. So I don't claim to be an expert on the Endangered Species Act, and if you need an Endangered Species Act 101, this is your slide, but I'm not going to get into details, and if you have deeper questions about it, I may end up trying to look into those for you or deferring you to someone else. But the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to protect and recover imperiled species and their ecosystems. And species are listed based on biological status and threats, and they look and review 5 different categories. And these categories are habitat damage or destruction, species overutilization, disease or predation, inadequacy of existing protection, and other natural or man-made factors. And then a species may be not listed or listed as threatened or endangered. And a threatened species is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. Species listed as endangered is endangered of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And whether it's listed as threatened or endangered determines to some degree the management flexibility. So the proposed rule for whitebark is that it was listed as, or proposed to be listed as threatened with a Section 4D rule. And so this is a proposed rule. It doesn't necessarily mean that whitebark will receive a final rule. What is prohibited under this proposed rule would be removal of whitebark pine on federal lands and the import and export and activities related to interstate and forward commerce. Not prohibited would be federal forest management, restoration, or research related activities. And the 4D rule, which I'm not super keen on, but it allows customization of the prohibitions and regulation of activities to provide for the conservation of threatened species. And what this means, I believe, is essentially that it allows more flexibility for agencies outside federal agencies, provides these other entities more flexibility in management. And they also decided that designation of critical habitat was not needed since habitat loss is not a threat to survival. The threats are directly biological and not human-induced. So given this information, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts from the knowledge that you already have and then maybe what you've heard today? What are your thoughts on the proposed Endangered Species Act listing? And I'm going to pull up the poll here. So your choices are yes, threatened as proposed, yes, but endangered, no, and not sure. All right, looks like just about everyone has voted. So Most of you feel yes, but endangered. 63% of you and 26% of you say yes, threatened as proposed, and then the rest not sure. Nobody for no. So, right, I was just curious. That's the only reason for that poll. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. Back to the presentation, moving on to whitebark pine restoration. So regardless of what happens with the listing, there is a lot of great work in restoration that's already going on and that will continue to occur no matter the listing status. There's a lot of wonderful resources available in regard to whitebark pine restoration. Some of these are shown on this slide. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the more prominent documents and resources. Diana Tombach and others produced a wonderful whitebark pine book that I recommend you, if you're really interested in whitebark pine, you check out Whitebark Pine Communities, Ecology and Restoration. John Schwant produced the Whitebark Pine in Peril, a Case for Restoration document that is a range-wide assessment of whitebark pine. The Keen et al. Document is the current range-wide restoration strategy for whitebark pine. There's also a restoration strategy for whitebark pine in the Pacific Northwest. And there are several umbrella groups that act to protect whitebark pine and other high elevation white pines, including the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee, which has a whitebark pine subcommittee, and they have a restoration strategy for the Greater Yellowstone area. Of course, there's the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, and probably the largest effort to date is the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan, which is in progress. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And then there's another group, the Crown of the Continent High Five group, that is working on protecting whitebark pine and protecting and restoring whitebark and limber pine in the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. They're working on a whitebark pine restoration strategy as well. And they actually used their process. It was a pilot for the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan. So a little bit more about that National Restoration Plan. It was initiated in 2006, and it is a collaborative effort between the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, American Forests, and the U.S. Forest Service, as well as several other agencies like the National Park Service and some tribal lands as well. It builds upon the existing range-wide restoration strategy that was put out by Bob Keene and others in 2012. And this plan is a geographic plan that focuses on prioritized core areas for restoration. And these core areas will represent about 20 to 30% of whitebark pine distribution. And the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation is working closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to align this National Restoration Plan with a potential threatened species recovery plan, which would be required if whitebark is listed as threatened. Another major effort that I wanted to let everyone know about is the Whitebark Pine Restoration Funding Program that occurs through Forest Health Protection of the U.S. Forest Service. This is the program that I help administer. It was initiated originally in 2007 by John Schwant. He is a retired plant pathologist who used to work out of the Coeur d'Alene field office. He's the one that conducted this range-wide assessment of whitebark pine and produced this document, Whitebark Pine in Peril. His work, in conjunction with some lobbying by the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, and created this funding opportunity for whitebark pine restoration projects that enhance existing whitebark pine, and provide regeneration opportunities, and increase proportion of whitebark pine that are blister rust resistant. And to date, this program has funded 331 projects. $3.7 million in forest health protection funds have been distributed, with 7.2 million matching funds, for a total of 11 million for these whitebark pine restoration projects throughout the West. And I want to also say that if you're interested in learning more about any of these projects that are occurring, they are all housed on a database that is on the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation website. So you can go check those out if you're more interested in learning more about those. So moving on to some of these restoration actions that will help to promote whitebark pine and that are occurring currently, and the goal is to aim to do more of these. Some of these that I'm listing have come from this range-wide restoration strategy by Bob Keene and others. But these restoration actions that promote whitebark pine include planting, mechanical cutting, prescribed burning, conserving genetic diversity, harnessing natural resistance to white pine blister rust, surveying and monitoring, and outreach and education. And I'll go through these. Planting. So ideally, when we're planting whitebark pine, we want to plant from seedlings that are grown from seed collected from what we call our plus trees. And these are trees that have been identified as rust resistant by seedling progeny and rust screenings, or they're trees that are phenotypically rust resistant trees. And what this means are that these are trees out on the landscape that occur in areas where there's maybe a high amount of rust, but these trees appear to be rust-free or nearly rust-free. And one important point about these trees that are identified as plus trees, these trees that continue to have cone collections made from them, we want to make sure that they are protected from mountain pine beetle. We do have a method to help prevent mountain pine beetle attack on these high value trees. And what you see in the photo there on the right is a tree stem with 2 verbenone packets placed on the tree. And verbenone is an anti-aggregation pheromone that repels mountain pine beetle. So when mountain pine beetle attacks a tree, there's a female beetle that flies and finds a tree and will bore into the tree, and it will send out a pheromone that tells all the other beetles to come enter. This tree is great, let's reproduce here. And so that aggregation pheromone be emitted until those beetles fill up that tree. And then once there's no more room in that tree, the beetles emit an anti-aggregation pheromone to repel any more beetles. And that's where that verbenone comes from. So in addition to planting seedlings, there has been some research on direct seeding or direct planting of seeds. And this may be an option on some sites, but it's a little more difficult to have success with direct seeding than it is with planting seedlings. Mechanical cuttings. The goal of cutting is to reduce competition near whitebark pine. In general, this means that we're not cutting the whitebark pine, but instead we're cutting trees close to whitebark pine or in whitebark pine stands. And there are different types of thinnings or cuttings that can occur. Here's a few examples. One of them would be group selection, where all trees except whitebark pine are cut. There are thinnings where non-whitebark trees below a threshold diameter are cut. And then a more recent and more promoted method is daylighting. And this is it's also more cost effective. It's removing trees in the nearby vicinity of a whitebark pine tree. And oftentimes mechanical cutting is also paired with other restoration activities like burning or planting. So prescribed burning mimics wildland fire. And the goal of prescribed burning is to help reduce competition. It reduces fuel and also creates openings for nutcrackers to disperse seeds. And the prescribed burning may occur at varying intensities. I think in general, most prescribed burning is either low intensity or moderate intensity. Whitebark pine is relatively fire resistant. Its bark is pretty thick. It's thicker than lodgepole pine, but not quite as thick as ponderosa pine. And low intensity burns will kill competing understory and whitebark pine stands. Moderate intensity burns would mimic mixed severity fires. So there would be some areas that it's just creeping and killing the understory. And then there are certain areas where it may burn hotter and create openings for seed dispersal. And then high intensity fires are used less frequently because they're difficult to control, but they can create large areas, large open areas, which would be good for Clark's nutcracker to distribute seeds, where other tree species cannot, the windblown seeds might not make it that far into the center of a burn area. These types of burns probably wouldn't occur in a whitebark stand, but would be suggested to burn in nearby whitebark So it would be close to these seed sources and not necessarily burning in the whitebark sand. Cone collections and conserving genetic diversity is another restoration action. We collect cones for seeds for growing into seedlings for regeneration. This is called operational cone collections. Seeds may be collected for conserving genetic diversity through long-term gene banking. And we also collect seeds for studies and research, most prominently for screening for white pine blister rust resistance. Harnessing that natural whitebark pine or white pine blister rust resistance, we identify those trees that we think are resistant and collect seed from them. Seedlings are grown, and then those seedlings are then artificially inoculated in a controlled environment with white pine blister rust to determine whether or not they are resistant. Also, surveys and monitoring are another important restoration activity. Monitoring for things like white pine blister rust levels, mountain pine beetle, overall health of whitebark pine, natural regeneration occurring, and then also keeping aware of other stressors that may be important at the local level. Surveys and monitoring can help prioritize restoration strategies. And as equally important is surveying and monitoring after restoration strategies have been implemented so they can be adapted if needed. And I threw in outreach and education as a restoration activity, even though it's more indirect, but it does help raise awareness of whitebark pine issues and maybe garner more interest in funding or restoration activities. So there are challenges to whitebark pine restoration. I have another poll question here. Oops. Oh, I was still sharing results. Sorry about that. Okay, so what do you think is the biggest challenge for whitebark pine restoration? We have funding, remoteness or wilderness. Is it time, gaps in research, mountain pine beetle outbreaks, or other? All right, looks like most everyone has voted. You're all right. I'm just curious what what you thought. Funding received the most votes, and then remoteness and wilderness, and then time and mountain pine beetle outbreaks, gaps in research, and then other. So yes, remoteness and wilderness certainly is a big challenge to whitebark pine restoration. Much whitebark pine is actually in remote areas or wilderness, and it can certainly limit access and also the types of activities that can occur, especially thinnings and wildfire, and may hamper cone collections and planting. And then wilderness is special. There's certainly many activities, restoration activities that are not allowed in wilderness or that require a process to conduct. In general, the activities that are permitted in wilderness are cone collecting and surveying and monitoring. Another challenge is that whitebark pine is slow to grow and slow to produce seeds. It can take sometimes upwards of 60 years or more for a whitebark pine to produce seeds. So that definitely puts a hamper on cone collection, collecting cones and seeds. There are definitely gaps in research, particularly concerning the frequency of blister rust resistance on the landscape. And then also the mountain pine beetle impacts can increase urgency to whitebark pine restoration because they can remove these trees with rust resistance. And then of course, declining funding. And I can speak to that in reference to the Forest Health Protection Whitebark Pine Restoration Funding Program. Funding initially started out at about $250,000 per year, and that did decline from 2007 to last year to only $100,000 per year. But this year there was some more interest in funding, and it increased to about 100. We think it'll be about 150,000 this year. So at least it's moving in that direction, and I think also the recent proposed listing status is helping a little bit to raise awareness to increase the funding. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'll take questions, but I also wanted to point out a few things. I have several great folks who came before me who have given this presentation or a similar presentation, not necessarily this one, but given a similar presentation that I have also shared or used slide and images from, and these are John Schwant, Holly Kearns, and Sandy Kegley, and there are some others as well. And then I also want to give a shout out to the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. You can find them online at whitebarkfound.org. We partner with them for several different projects, and they are a great source of information for whitebark pine, and there are lots of resources listed on their webpage. You can donate or become a member. If you want to find out more about the National Restoration Plan, they have a lot of information about that on their webpage. And also, if you want to find out more about the restoration projects that are occurring that are funded by that National the Forest Health Protection Whitebark Pine Restoration Program, that database listing all those projects is on their webpage. And they also put on annual conferences, and there's one occurring or scheduled to occur in October of this year. And I'm not 100% sure whether or not that's going to be virtual or not this year, but you can check that out if you're interested in attending. So with that, I'm finished, and thank you all for listening, and I'll take your questions.
Christy, we have a number of questions here. Do you want me to read them off to you, or
sure. Let me
chat yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I can see. I don't see where the question. Oh, here's the chat.
Okay, you got it.
I might have to stop sharing. Sorry for my. Oh, here we go. Here's the chat. It just pulled up. Okay. I know. Okay, so I see in the chat, we talked a little bit, or you had asked me about the oldest tree, the oldest whitebark pine. And I see from Rebecca Franklin that tree RRR15 collected in central Idaho had a cross-dated age of 1,267 years. And there's another cross-dated age by Brian Luckman at 882 years for a tree in the Rockies of Alberta. Thanks, Rebecca. That's great. And let's see, Marcia. Has unfortunately been vandalism to Great Basin bristlecones that were known to be 4,000 years plus old. Methuselah is over 4,600 years old and location is not disclosed. Yep, that's true. Snowmobiles are a local threat, like a Roman nose. I believe that for sure. Ken asks, did the rabies control projects of the past have any real effect on blister rust? Good question, Ken. Unfortunately, at least on the East Coast, it actually did have some effect on blister rust. on eastern white pine, the efforts for rabies eradication did work a little bit better out there, but unfortunately in the west, rabies occurs in a lot of areas where the folks could not actually get to remove rabies, and so it was not as effective in the west as it was in the east. So that's why that program was discontinued. Another comment from Paul says, please consider commenting directly to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and asking, like a lot of conservation groups that are doing, that it be listed as endangered, which has more protections than that weak threatened status. And then Preston included the where to make those comments. That's great, and the link there. And there's another option, direct to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that Paul posted. Here's a question. What resources does the ESA listing bring to whitebark pine conservation that is not already being provided? So there are certain protections that it would provide to whitebark pine. As far as resources go, I don't know. That kind of remains to be seen. There may be someone else here that could answer a little bit more to that, but it does raise awareness of whitebark pine issues and may end up with more funding. I honestly believe that we're getting more funding for the restoration program this year because of its listing status. There are probably garners more interest in restoration, but that's all that I could really say right now. If anybody has any other answers to that question, feel free to chime in. Ken says, I think we have a plus tree on the Scotchman Peak Trail. I wouldn't doubt it. I know there's a lot of pine that way. That don't want plantings and wilderness, and that is true. There's a lot of back and forth about whether or not whitebark pine should be planted or not in wilderness. And there's a snippet about that in the existing whitebark pine restoration strategy. If you want to learn more about that, I think there's a page or two that talks about what's permitted and what is not permitted in wilderness, and then the activities, if you want to plant or want to do something that's not permitted, the process that you have to go through to potentially do those kind of activities. There's a question about the link for watching tomorrow that cannot be shared. I'm not sure the answer to that question. Preston?
I will have a YouTube link to this presentation later, and I can share that with all the attendees. Great.
And I have a question about where was the image on the slide, bottom left taken, stunning. I'm not sure. That was a slide, it was on a slide from Sandy Kegley. I thought the image was also equally as beautiful. It was taken by Dana Perkins, champion of whitebark and limber pine, but I'm not sure. I'd have to find out. From Paul, what is the status of the proposed restoration? What is the status of the proposed restoration status on Forest Service and Idaho Department of Land's property on Gisborne Mountain in the Priest River Experimental Forest? I do not know the answer to that question. I'm a little bit familiar with that, but I do not have an answer to that question, Paul, but I can find out for you and possibly get back to you if that would be okay. If you have an email address or something I can get, then I can get an answer to that question. From Janet, how much of this presentation is applicable to limber pine as well? Good question. A lot of it is applicable to limber pine. The same 4 major threats exist to limber pine as to whitebark. Limber pine is a little bit different because it does occur at a wider distribution and wider elevation range. The seeds of limber pine, though, the cones open readily at maturity. Seeds are distributed by Clark's nutcracker and other mammals, but it does not rely on Clark's nutcracker for seed dispersal. So it does have a little bit of an advantage in reproduction versus whitebark pine. And even though bears are known to eat the seeds of limber pine, limber pine is not as an important food source to grizzly bears as whitebark pine. But just about everything else in this presentation, I would say, is applicable to limber pine. So same threats, same restoration strategies, and it's just in its the status of limber pine as well. There are areas where I have seen entire stands of limber pine killed by a combination of blister rust and mountain pine beetle, but there are also areas where limber pine is doing pretty well. So it's a mix, kind of like whitebark. It may be in a little bit better position just because of the broader distribution and broader elevation range, but on the same trajectory, I believe. Let's see. The alternate hosts, Castellaria ribes, and the third alternate host for species in pedicularis. And is it unusual that action hasn't already been taken for a species that has had this much loss to designate it endangered or threatened? I don't know necessarily that it's unusual because it is a tree species. I don't think they garner as much attention as animals, wildlife, and fish. That's just my perspective. Somebody may have additional thoughts on that. But it has taken a long time to get to where we are and a lot of effort to get to this point. For how long does whitebark pine seed stay viable? That's a good question. And I think it's about, I want to say 2 to 3 years, whitebark pine and seed caches would stay viable. And do we have other trees in North America that are officially on the endangered species list? Maybe Florida yew. Anybody have an answer to that question? I'm not sure.
Is it the American chestnut?
I would assume so, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Unless,
right?
unless they've already given up on it altogether.
I know, my only thought would be is that they've given up on it. It's not even on the list anymore because they've just completely given up. But yeah, I'm not sure. That's the one that I would assume so, but I don't know of any others. Yeah, okay. Well, I don't hear from anyone else. If you have any, or maybe somebody's Googling it right now for us.
I was just going to say easily Googleable. I was just being lazy in my question.
And then the last question I see here is Clark's nutcracker decreasing as a result of whitebark pine decline? And I did recently read somewhere that there is a decline in Clark's nutcracker, but I don't know the extent of it, and I don't want to misstate any of that. But I did, and I can't remember where I read it. But probably also easily Googleable, but I did read that, yes. Any other questions?
Christy, I had a question.
Sure.
Can the white pine blister rust spores be transferred pine to pine? You said it has to go through an alternate host.
Correct. No, transferred from pine to pine. There are some native rust diseases that do go from pine to pine. One of the examples of those would be Western gall rust that occurs on like lodgepole and ponderosa pines, the 2 and 3 needled pines, and that occurs directly from pine to pine. The white pine blister rust definitely needs the alternate host to complete its life cycle.
So you'd mentioned that the basidiospores don't travel as far as the spores coming off the pines. Does that reduce the transfer then, because they can't travel as far to get back to the pines?
They still can travel a fair amount of distance under the right conditions, which is generally less than 10 miles. It's usually even far less than that. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily an impediment to its distribution. Maybe more the frequency of distribution than anything.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Really, a lot of interest in this. There is one more. One more comment here and a question.
Oh, I see here. Okay. I see is Castellan pedicularis are hemiparasitic plants. Do you think this plays any role in distribution? Distribution of the rust, I'm assuming. And I don't know. I know that Castellan species in Castellan pedicularis are not as important alternate hosts as rabies species. So I'm not sure, and I don't know that if we know that quite yet.
Okay. I think we might be out of questions. And I really personally want to thank you for joining us today and sharing all this important information. And I encourage everyone to make a comment on the listing. From the Kinnikinnick Native Plant Society's standpoint, we certainly are in favor of that. And I really also want to say to Christy that thank you as a government employee, professional, all you've had to put up with this past year, trying to get field research done when you've been professionally distanced, and hope you can get back to normalcy and get back in the field this coming summer. So thank you.
Thank you, Preston. I hope we all can get back to some normalcy soon.
Yes, we can meet in person again. So with that, I'm just going to ask everybody to, if you want to, unmute yourself and give Christy a round of applause.
Yay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Christy.
Thanks. This was fun. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Observation.